Amy Wroe Bechtel loved to run. Ever since she'd been a teenager, she'd found something in running that brought a calmness and joy to her life. Throughout high school and later college, she pursued running and had even participated in the Boston Marathon. When nothing else in life was consistent, running always was. Newlywed to her college sweetheart, Steve Bechtel, Amy was happy about building a future. The young couple had recently closed on a home in Lander, Wyoming, and there was a lot to get done. On July 24, 1997, Steve kissed his wife goodbye as he headed over an hour away to do some rock climbing with a friend. Amy planned to take care of some errands and then go for a run. Later that afternoon, Amy drove up to the Sinks Canyon campground area of Shoshone National Park. She was planning to organize a 10K race and wanted to begin plotting out the route. After she finished, Amy parked her car on the side of Loop Road, a steep, curvy stretch of road leading up into the higher elevations. Dressed in her yellow tank top and black shorts, Amy left her keys in the unlocked car and began running. She never returned to her vehicle. As the hours passed, Steve became worried about his wife and began calling and looking for her. When 11 p.m. was approaching, he finally called 911 to report her missing. This call would kick off one of the largest search and rescue operations in the history of Wyoming, but would ultimately turn up nothing. With nowhere else to look, authorities began wondering if Steve might know more about his wife's disappearance than he had admitted to, while Steve believes someone had abducted his wife, and all the energy spent investigating him was allowing that person to get away. This is Trace Evidence, Episode 67, The Disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the 1997 disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel, a confusing and baffling case full of sadness, tragedy, and suspicion. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances, examining a different case each Monday. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter @TraceEvPod, on Instagram @TraceEvidencePod, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence. You can visit the website at trace-evidence.com for full episodes, social media links, merchandise, and much more. Trace Evidence is also on Patreon, so if you would like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence, where you can get rewards such as stickers, pins, and commercial-free episodes. There's also a PayPal donation link on the website for those of you who don't wish to go through Patreon. This show is a complete one-man operation, and your support is greatly appreciated. This week we examine the disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel from Lander, Wyoming in July of 1997. It's a haunting case with very little evidence and a great wealth of speculation. This is episode 67, The Disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel. Amy Joy Wroe was born on August 4, 1972, to parents Dwayne and Joanne Wroe in Santa Barbara, California. The fourth and youngest child of Dwayne and Joanne, Amy came into a family where she would have two older sisters and an older brother. Despite the West Coast location of her birth, Amy grew up in Wyoming, spending time in the city of Jackson and later Douglas. Ultimately, Amy's father would become the city administrator for Douglas, and this is where Amy would later attend high school and spend a large quantity of her youth. Douglas is the county seat of Converse County, sitting in south-central Wyoming, and has a population of just over 6,000 residents. In total, Douglas accounts for less than 5 square miles. Public education is provided by the Converse County School District, and the town has a primary school, intermediate school, upper elementary school, middle school, and high school. Douglas is an area well known for its outdoor activities, from hunting to fishing, running, and exploring the vast natural wonders of the locale. Not far from Douglas, one can find the Medicine Bow National Forest and the Thunder Basin National Grassland. Douglas is also widely known for its horse riding and racing culture. Douglas has a great deal of history, from being a former stop on the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad, upon which many settlers and pioneers made their trek out west, to the days when Douglas was known as Fort Fetterman. There's a little something for everyone, but for those who have a love of athleticism, outdoor recreation, and the beauty of scenic vistas, Douglas has it all. Despite age differences, the Wroe siblings formed a close and tight bond from an early age. The foursome was often out about, playing games, running through the wilderness, fishing and hiking. They each looked out for one another and were, in a sense, one another's best friends. The siblings were so close, in fact, that years later, when Nels, Amy's older brother, got married, rather than selecting a friend to be his best man, all 3 of his sisters stood in that place. Nels would later express that, throughout all their lives, no one knew them better than they knew each other, and no matter what the situation may have been, Amy and her siblings knew that they could always turn to each other for support and assistance. All of this took place under the loving and caring umbrella of Dwayne and Joanne, who were very involved in their children's lives, but also able to hold gently enough to allow them to experience the world on their own terms. From a young age, Amy was described as being incredibly kind, sweet, and loving. Almost every single quote about her from friends and family depicts the young woman as being the type of person people just wanted to be around. She was bright, vibrant, had a glowing sense of humor, and was very protective towards those she loved. One word which consistently shows up in discussions about Amy is ambition. She was a driven young woman who had dreams she wished to achieve, and nothing was going to stop her. She was willing to put in the effort, to work hard, to push herself to the limits, and no matter how long it might take, there was little of anything she couldn't conquer. She was also known to speak her mind. Amy didn't bottle up her thoughts and opinions, she shared them freely. If Amy had something to say, you wouldn't have to wonder. She had no problem opening up in that way, though she was often careful of the manner in which she delivered information. Amy, from time to time, could be quiet and a little withdrawn, but this seemed almost due to an analytical mindset. She would often watch the developments of situations before offering her thoughts on them, before getting directly involved. Her intelligence was picked up on early enough in her life, and many knew that Amy, even when she wasn't speaking, well, her mind was turning a mile a minute. Her personality and intelligence would serve her well throughout her youth, where she would make friends, forge strong bonds, and achieve high grades in school. It wouldn't be until high school that Amy would face what would begin as her first major challenge in something that she had always loved: running. She had been running since she was 13 years old, and while she enjoyed it, she wasn't exactly competitive. Initially, this had just been something she had done for fun, but when she attended high school, a close friend's father was the coach of the track team, and after some poking and prodding, Amy agreed to try out for the team. She would ultimately make the team, though she was hardly the star runner. Her brother Nels would later explain, quote, "I don't necessarily think she was a natural, but you know what? She persevered, and she was dedicated to doing what she wanted to do, and doing it very well." End quote. Amy loved to run, but now she found herself in a situation where she needed to push herself further and put in even more effort. Her improvements were slow and gradual, but throughout high school, she would continue to make advances and grow her skill. Oftentimes, she could be found on her own, running through the beautiful scenery of Douglas. One interesting distinction for Amy was that while many others went out and jogged to build up their endurance and strength, this was not her approach. Amy didn't jog, she flat out ran. This wasn't something she looked at as a slow and steady, but something she would approach like a fighter, forcing herself to go further, to move faster, and yet all the while, she maintained an incredibly positive attitude. Even while dashing along the side of the road, sweating and tired with her muscles aching, she would always smile and wave to passers-by as she hustled along her path. During her time in high school, Amy never rose higher than the 4th or 5th best runner on the team. After completing high school, Amy would go on to attend college at the University of Wyoming at Laramie. Laramie was located approximately 137 miles to the south of Douglas, and Amy was eager to begin the next chapter of her life. While attending university, Amy approached cross-country coach Jim Sanchez about being a walk-on for the team. Sanchez gave her a shot, but found it difficult to imagine the young woman was ever going to rise up and be one of his star athletes. According to Sanchez, she was almost always lagging behind her teammates. In some instances, Amy would be as far behind as a quarter mile, and while she maintained a spot on the team, she was never part of the traveling squad and didn't participate in any cross-country meets that held any level of significance. Despite this, it was her sweet, kind, and driven personality that kept her spot. Sanchez saw something in her and believed that if she could ever find a way to set it free, she could be a hell of a runner. This continued through Amy's freshman and sophomore years, but then, during the winter of her junior year, Amy spoke to Sanchez about leaving the team. It wasn't that she didn't love running or that she didn't believe she could get better, but her financial situation was presenting her with challenges. Paying for school wasn't a breeze, and on top of her academic requirements and her place on the cross-country team, the young woman was working 3 part-time jobs to help pay the bills. Taking pity on her, Sanchez offered Amy a partial scholarship for the next semester. He explained that she would be taken care of through the spring, but that the next year, the scholarship would have to go to a better runner. He didn't want to hold back a woman who was far exceeding Amy's skills, and Amy understood and agreed. However, Amy was determined to keep that scholarship, and as she always did, rose to the challenge, determined not only to earn the scholarship, but to become one of the best runners Coach Sanchez had ever seen. Throughout that spring, Amy improved considerably. She was keeping up with her teammates during practice, no longer the girl lagging behind. She was pushing herself and her body was sculpting as she drove harder and harder to achieve her goals. This all culminated in 1994 when she placed 7th at the Western Athletic Conference Championships, helping her team score some hard-fought points and earning herself that scholarship for her senior year. While Sanchez was blown away by her improvement in the fall, she would blow everyone else away too. In the first semester of her senior year, Amy was named Runner of the Week twice, and at the end of the season, she had finished 8th in the whole conference. At the Winter Championships, she competed in the 3,000 and 5,000, setting a school record for the 3,000 and earning herself a place as an All-American. While running had been developing into something Amy was loving even more, there was also another part of her life that was coming along nicely. During her time at school, Amy had met and fallen in love with Steve Bechtel. Bechtel was also an athletic person who loved the outdoors and shared Amy's sense of drive and determination. Their relationship developed quickly and became incredibly strong over their time in Laramie. Friends would later say it was like they were made for each other. Everything each had been looking for in a mate, they found in one another. After graduating in 1995, the couple continued on, beginning to set their sights on building a future together. In the meantime, Amy was training to compete in the Boston Marathon. She ultimately finished the marathon 40 minutes after the first-placed winner, but when former coach Sanchez was asked about this, he responded, quote, I knew by then never to underestimate Amy. I knew it would take her a long time to become a good marathoner, but that she'd eventually get there." End quote. Eventually, Steve and Amy's relationship would blossom into something even bigger, and the two would get married. Together, they would move to Lander, Wyoming, some 200 miles west of Douglas. Lander was known locally as a hidden gem in Wyoming, holding a population of just 12,000. It was, in a sense, a mecca for those who were outdoorsy and athletic. There was a large rock climbing community in the area, to which Steve eventually became a part, and Amy herself loved the beauty and natural surroundings. The Shoshone National Forest was nearby and would become Amy's chosen location for running. Together, the young couple was striking out on their own, and in Lander, they rented a small cottage from Todd Skinner, a local rock climber known as one of the best. Amy rock climbed from time to time, but for her, running was her true passion. It wouldn't be long before Amy and Steve found themselves surrounded by new, adventurous, like-minded friends. By the summer of 1997, 24-year-old Amy and her husband, 27-year-old Steve, were on the precipice of taking another huge first step. After a lot of looking, debate, and consideration, the young couple were finalizing the purchase on their first home. Settling into Lander had become easy for the couple, and the longer they had been there, the more deeply they'd fallen in love with it. Buying a home was a way of not only solidifying their place there, but also would grant them the platform from which to begin building a family. At the time, both Steve and Amy were working part-time jobs, one they shared at a local sporting goods store, and another Amy did for a local gym. By the end of July, they had closed on the house, and both were eager to begin moving in. On the morning of Thursday, July 24th, both Amy and Steve had the day off. The couple were excited to have a little freedom that day, and Steve made plans to go rock climbing with a friend. Amy explained that she had a list of errands she needed to run and plans to set into place before beginning the move into the new house. Steve would later explain that she didn't mention running to him that morning, but that, quote, "it would have been like telling me she was going to brush her teeth that day," end quote. Running was just something it was known that Amy would do. Steve's plans were taking him and a friend to Du Bois, some 70 miles away. There was a rock wall there, which Steve and his friend wanted to hike to and climb. It was an exciting day for Steve, and so he packed up his gear, kissed Amy goodbye, and went on his way. Amy's plans consisted mostly of random tasks she needed to get done before she could go and run like she wanted to. She had a children's weight training class which she co-taught at the Wind River Fitness Center with the owner, Dudley Irvine. She had recently become a certified trainer, which afforded her the ability to make more money, and while the job had a lot of good downtime and perks, Amy was excited to build on that foundation. It was a good experience as she and Steve had discussed opening up their own gym at some point in time. Amy had friends at the gym, though some did express later that while Amy was sweet, charming, and everyone got along, no one was very close to her. She listened, she chatted, but she never really opened up to her coworkers. She chose to keep things close to the vest. Amy said goodbye to Irvine at approximately 12 noon and left to run her errands. She reappeared at the gym around 12:30, picking up a bag of bottles to bring to the recycling center. She waved goodbye and exited. She would never return to the Wind River Fitness Center. The exact timeline for Amy's day is a little sketchy, as though certain activities can be confirmed, few have times associated with them. It's known that Amy did make it to the recycling center. In addition to this, she placed calls to local utility companies to begin setting up accounts for electricity, water, and telephone services at the new house. The final confirmed errand Amy ran that day took her to a local photo store, Camera Connection. She spoke with an employee about a particular photo she wanted to enter into a contest. She wanted the photo to be printed and framed for her entry. Amy was in the shop for approximately 5 minutes. Some reports detail Amy leaving at 1:30, while others specify 2:30, although 1:30 seems to be confirmed by law enforcement. Either way, the employee working behind the counter would be the last person to have definitely seen Amy that afternoon. Having completed these tasks, Amy decided she wanted to take a drive up to the Sinks Canyon campground area in the Shoshone National Park. She'd been planning on organizing a 10K race in that area and wanted to drive along the road, mapping out specific locations, getting a rough accounting of the mileage, and then go out and run the trails herself to figure out the logistics of it all. The plan was to map everything out, get a good sense of the path the 10K would follow, and then she hoped return home, clean up, and go out to dinner with Steve, who would be returning around that same time. Before heading to the park, Amy went home first and changed into her running gear, a yellow tank top, black shorts, and Adidas shoes. Amy arrived in the Sinks Canyon area in her white Toyota Tercel. She had run the area many times in the past, although lately she'd kept running every other day as nagging shin splints had been causing her some discomfort. This is hardly the first time she's encountered this kind of physical challenge, and while it can be difficult, she was determined to get her run in as she wanted to. Amy's to-do list sat on the passenger seat as she drove along, and she made notes of specific landmarks and mileage. Continuing along the way, her white Toyota drove off the pavement and turned onto Loop Road, a steeply graded road full of sharp switchbacks, which carried her up more than 2,000 feet in elevation. 5 miles into the Loop Road, the terrain levels out and passes near Fry Lake, the location Amy had selected for the finish line of the 10K. Amy had marked out approximately 6 miles worth of course, though the difference between driving it and running it could be immense. Amy approached the Burnt Gulch cutoff, where the road splits, and pulled off to the side, parking her car with its front pointing uphill. She tucked her car keys under the papers on her passenger seat, left the car unlocked, and headed for a run on the Loop Road and possibly into the trails and forestry of the park. Any estimates of what time this occurred are merely guesses based on unconfirmed witness sightings. What is known is that Amy's car will not move from this spot, will remain unlocked, and Amy, by all accounts, will not return to it. That afternoon, Steve and friend Sam Leitner hiked all the way to the rock wall, but as time passed, the weather began to turn, threatening to storm, and the two decided it might be best not to attempt the climb. Instead, they tried to map out routes they could take the next time when they did do the climb, and at approximately 3:30 p.m., both men left the area, driving off separately, with Steve behind the wheel of his blue pickup truck. Steve arrived home between 4 and 4:30 p.m. and found the house empty, though he wasn't surprised. Amy often ran in the late afternoon, and so he went about his business, cleaning up and relaxing at home. At some point, he walked next door to Todd Skinner's house and said hello and hung out for a little while. Later, he called a friend who taught philosophy, though the friend wasn't in, so Steve left a message. The call log will later show that this call occurred at 4:43 p.m. As day began turning into evening, Steve started to get worried. While Amy was often out running, she was usually home by this time. Each minute that ticked by gave Steve more worry, and around 6:45 p.m., Todd Skinner and his girlfriend knocked on the door. They were planning to go see a movie that night and wanted to know if Steve wanted to come along. It was at this time that he confessed he was a little worried and he was going to stay home and wait for Amy. He began doing busy work to try and distract himself. He drove a few items over to their newly purchased house, visited the sporting goods store where they both worked, and then headed home. Several more hours passed, and at 9 p.m., Steve began to wonder if perhaps Amy had gone to her parents'. They had previously made plans to pick up some furniture, but a tragedy in Steve's family had delayed their plans. Steve called and spoke to Amy's mother, Joanne, who hadn't seen Amy all day and now was also concerned. It was unlike her daughter to go somewhere this long without leaving a note, calling, or telling somebody. According to Steve, at this time, he got in his truck and drove around to locations that he knew Amy often ran. One after the other, she wasn't there, and the only one left to check was Sinks Canyon and the Loop Road. While driving that way, it occurred to him that if Amy needed help or called, he wouldn't be home to get the call, and so he turned once again and drove back home, not continuing on to Sinks Canyon where, unbeknownst to him, Amy's car sat along the side of Loop Road. Steve placed another call to Amy's parents, called her sister, and then called his own parents. Finally, at 10:30 p.m., Steve called 911 and was put in contact with the Fremont County Sheriff's Department. The tone of his 911 call will later be the source of speculation and suspicion, as almost in a joking manner, Steve's opening statement to the 911 operator was, quote, "Hi, this is Steve Bechtel calling. I'm missing a person and was wondering if you had an extra." End quote. A sheriff's deputy arrived at the home at approximately 10:45 p.m., and Steve explained the situation. Around this same time, Todd Skinner and his girlfriend arrived home from the movies and stopped by when they saw the sheriff's car. After discussing the situation, giving a description, and having a back and forth about possible whereabouts, Sinks Canyon is mentioned. Todd and his girlfriend decided to go up there and check while Steve continued speaking to the deputy. At the time, the assumption was that it was likely Amy may have been injured while running and couldn't get back to receive help. They hoped the injury was only minor, a twisted or cracked ankle, maybe some bumps and bruises. While driving into the area, Skinner turned onto Loop Road and headed up the steep grade. After passing by Fry Lake, they came to the Burnt Gulch turnoff, and there, gleaming in their headlights, was Amy's white car. Approaching the car, Skinner and his girlfriend found it unlocked. Amy's keys were still tucked under the to-do list on her passenger seat, but nothing seemed to be amiss. The couple searched the cars for clues, but discovered nothing and, in the process, likely contaminated any possible evidence that might have been there. At this point, the two began calling out Amy's name into the darkness, though they heard no response. At approximately 1 a.m., Skinner's girlfriend placed a call to Steve, explaining to him that they'd found the car, but had no indication of where Amy was. Steve relayed this information to the sheriff's department, and they in turn contacted Fremont County Search and Rescue. The leader of that team, Chip Williams, began to drive out to the car, and Steve did the same, picking up a friend and arriving before Williams. Steve brought along with him lanterns, flashlights, sleeping bags, and food. He and his 3 friends plan to search for Amy, but when Williams arrives on the scene, he decides that the search team will assemble and head out into the wilderness at first light. A small 10-person team of some of the best climbers in Lander began searching in the dark, and Williams waited for morning to send out more, assuming that it's just as likely Amy will be found before the sun even rises. By 5 a.m., there was no sign of Amy, and the 10-person group of climbers had expanded to 25. Skinner and Steve are close with many of the skilled climbers in the area, and a lot of them know Amy, and so volunteers kept showing up and looking to pitch in. Williams began setting a perimeter with Amy's car at the center of it. This is hardly his first search. In fact, it's not uncommon for visitors and athletes from around the world who descend upon Lander to get lost in the unfamiliar wilderness. As such, they're extremely skilled and well-practiced at search and rescue operations. They found no clues at the vehicle to work with, and as the search began expanding in a wider and wider radius, Williams was surprised by the lack of evidence found. They couldn't locate footprints, nor any items which might suggest Amy had been in the area. Often, when someone is lost, they will leave items behind to indicate to searchers where they have been. By afternoon, the search had covered a wide swath and still nothing. At this time, Williams began to fear for the worst. As it became more clear to searchers in the sheriff's department that this may not be as easy as they'd imagined, the question of whether or not they were dealing with a missing person or the victim of a crime began to get asked. Amy's family was rushing towards the area to assist in the searches. Investigators poured over Amy's car and began questioning everyone who knew her and anyone who may have seen her. It's during this time that they find the last confirmed sighting was earlier in the afternoon at the camera shop. Investigators weren't the only ones growing concerned and suspicious. As Amy's brother Nels later explained, quote, "When I got up to the mountains, it's like literally 2 or 3 hours into it, and I'm realizing this is scary. This is a much different situation than I had originally thought. That's when I realized, wait a minute, we don't have a missing person on our hands. We have a situation that could be a crime." End quote. The initial search for Amy involved countless volunteers, police officers, and members of search and rescue. Many of them were very familiar with the area and had advanced knowledge of the forestry, mountains, caves, and waterways. Sheriff's deputies examine the car once again, and all they do find is Amy's to-do list, upon which, at the bottom, she had written down landmarks related to the 10K. There was no sign of a struggle or an animal attack, which has to be considered as there are bears and mountain lions in that area. There wasn't much of anything found, if anything at all. Dave King, formerly of the Fremont County Sheriff's Department, explained, quote, "The biggest thing they found was there were no clues. There's no evidence. If somebody falls prey to an animal, you find them. If somebody drops dead of a heart attack, anything you can think of, falling rock, the search team would have found that." End quote. As the first days of searching came to an end, hundreds of people were involved. As the search entered its second day, the search radius expanded gradually until more than 20 square miles were subjected to grid searches. Volunteers arrived on horseback and ATVs, tracking dogs were brought in, and a helicopter fitted with an infrared heat-seeking sensor was also involved. People set up tents and a makeshift command post was established at the summit near Fry Lake. The search continued for 5 days straight, with many searchers working rotating 12-hour shifts. They climbed down into canyons, scaled hills and mountains, covered large tracts of land, noting everywhere they had been, but nothing was found. On the 4th day, there was a glimmer of hope when footprints were discovered matching Amy's shoes, though later, a local boy admitted he had camped in the area recently and had the same shoes. Not a shred of clothing, a spot of blood, no sign that Amy had even been there. On July 29th, 5 days after Amy was last seen, the Fremont County Sheriff's Department changes the investigation from a missing persons case to a criminal investigation, and Dave King is put in charge. Dave King is a somewhat controversial figure in this case, with many feeling that, at the time, he wasn't experienced enough to be in charge. His state of mind and actions will be called into question later when criminal activities are uncovered. For Chip Williams, it was absolutely heartbreaking when search efforts were called off. When asked about it later, Williams explained, quote, "The worst moment was definitely the last day, the day when we came down out of the mountains. It finally hit me then that the search had been out of our hands from the get-go. All that effort, all that skill, all those talented and motivated people, none of that really meant a thing. We were back exactly where we started." End quote. As the criminal investigation took off, sheriff's deputies canvassed the entire town, setting up roadblocks, questioning everyone they came across, and trying to spread awareness. In the meantime, Amy's family printed flyers and plastered them all over town with yellow ribbons. The case drew media attention, and authorities were receiving more than 1,000 tips per day, though often they led nowhere. On July 30th, the Sheriff's Department requested the assistance of the FBI, and 25 agents were sent from the Casper and Denver field offices. For Amy's mother, Joanne, it doesn't seem real. She later says, quote, "It was such an emotional time. It was an out-of-body experience. There's no way that unless someone has experienced something like this, that they would be able to understand." End quote. A set of witnesses spoke to investigators around this time, Jim and Wendy Gibson. The couple were the owners of Landers Pronghorn Motel. According to their statements, shortly after 5 p.m., they drove past a woman running along Loop Road, heading in the direction of Burnt Gulch. According to the Gibsons, the woman was blonde and wasn't jogging, but was running fiercely, much the way many described Amy's style of running. Later that evening, around 7 p.m., they drove past that area again. Wendy claims to have seen Amy's car on the side of the road and a flash of something in the back seat. She wonders to this day if that was Amy in her car or perhaps someone else, and how things may have been different if they had stopped to check. The more investigators looked at Amy's disappearance, the more they began to believe that it may be connected to someone she knew. As is often the case, the first person on their list to question was Amy's husband, Steve Bechtel. On August 5th, Steve was brought down to the station for questioning, where he would speak with Dave King and FBI agent Rick McCullough. Steve was asked about his whereabouts, relationship with Amy, any problems, issues, or fights. He gave them every piece of information they requested, and then McCullough placed a folder down on the table, embraces Steve, explaining that they know he's responsible for Amy's disappearance, and they want him to take a polygraph test. Steve initially agreed, but then hired a lawyer who advised him against the polygraph. In response to this, sheriff's deputies arrived at Steve and Amy's cottage the next day with warrants to search the home and his truck. It wasn't entirely based around his behavior during the interview. They had a new witness who claimed to have seen Steve's blue pickup truck on the Loop Road the day Amy disappeared, and this witness said there was a blonde woman in the passenger seat. Little was found to assist investigators, though they did take into their custody journals written by both Amy and Steve over the past few years. The content of the journals draws attention, as investigators feel it suggests that the marriage may not have been as happy as Steve had told them. Looking for extra opinions, the journals were shown to Amy's family. It's at this time that several family members suggested that they had wondered in the past whether or not Steve had been abusive to Amy. They also felt that Steve was a very controlling person and had maintained a firm grip on her. Nels later explained, quote, "I think that, her relationship with Steve was rocky. She went where Steve wanted to go, lived where Steve wanted to live, and did what Steve wanted to do. That was not Amy. That was not the Amy I grew up with." End quote. Steve's resistance to the polygraph, coupled with the family's statements about the marriage and authorities' suggestion that he had been involved, caused a large rift not only between Steve and law enforcement, but also Steve and Amy's family. Joanne didn't understand why Steve wouldn't take the polygraph, and Steve argued that had authorities simply asked him to take it, he would have. But instead, they tried to pin it on him, and he felt they were going to try and railroad him. Most legal experts agree that there's no benefit to taking a polygraph, but in the media, Steve's refusal is represented as a husband with something to hide. The division lines expanded, with the town beginning to pick sides. Slowly, Steve's friends in the rock climbing community began to turn their backs on investigators who they felt were trying to railroad their friend. Steve later appeared on the Today Show, and when asked about his interrogation, he responded that authorities wanted to make him out to be the villain, saying, quote, "Let's go ahead and establish that Steve is a diabolical criminal, but first, let's establish that he was in the area for the crime and had motivation to do the crime." End quote. While Steve's friend Sam assured authorities that they were in Du Bois that day, investigators only found a gas receipt for Sam and felt that there's no solid evidence to prove that Steve was there or that he didn't leave earlier than he claimed. Due to the split, Amy's family and Steve operated their own plans to try and help. While the family worked closely with investigators, Steve organized his friends and they began sending out flyers all around Wyoming and then the whole country. They set up a phone line to receive tips on and had their own searches. Steve helped acquire and set up a reward for information leading to Amy's recovery. That reward was raised to $50,000, and Steve later explained, quote, "It's enough so that given the remote chance that there's more than one abductor, one might turn against the other to collect the reward. I'd give the money gladly and never ask anything more." End quote. By the end of August, the Fremont County Sheriff's Department publicly declared that their investigation was running out of options. Around this same time, in a bizarre turn of events, NASA informed investigators that the Russian space station Mir was orbiting over that area at the time and may be able to provide satellite photography of that location. A request for those images was submitted. In September, it was time for the 10K that Amy had planned. The events took place on September 28th, following the course Amy had previously established. 150 locals took part, as well as members of Amy's family. The race was renamed the Amy Bechtel Hill Climb, and it was used as a benefit to support future search efforts. There was a palpable tension between the family and Steve at this event, and this is the last time they communicate, as Steve will sever all relations with the family following the race. Steve said he would continue to take part in searches, offer rewards, and do his best to try and locate Amy, even if he had to do it on his own. He later stated, quote, "In all the scenarios I can imagine, there's nothing that can be worse than wondering if I'll ever see her again, when I'll ever see her again, and if I do, whether she'll be alive or dead." End quote. Tips continued to come in from around the country of alleged sightings of Amy, though each one failed to deliver on its promise. Sightings emanated from Texas, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. As 1997 came to a close, Amy's family and Steve Bechtel were all left wondering what could have happened and where she might be. In early 1998, the Fremont County Sheriff's Department received the images from the Mir space station, but unfortunately, thick cloud formations that day obscure the Earth below, and there's nothing useful found. A month later, in February, several members of Amy's family appear on the Geraldo Rivera show, discussing the case and issuing a plea for Steve to take the polygraph, but nothing changes on his side. The media latched on once again, with People magazine writing an article about Amy's disappearance. In March, 2 people contacted authorities in Sarasota, Florida, stating that after having read the article in People magazine, they believe they may have seen Amy in a parking lot the previous month. According to their account, the woman appeared to be confused and seemed to be homeless. Fremont County deputies followed the lead and flew to Florida, though quickly they were informed that the woman had been located and it was not Amy. Several months later, in June, authorities decided to search once again, hoping to reinvigorate the case. The search took place from June 17th to 21st, and for the first time, scuba divers were brought in to drag the bottom of Fry Lake. Unfortunately, this new round of searching failed to yield any results. As days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years, little develops for the case, but major changes take place on all sides. Now Sheriff Dave King resigns from the Fremont County Sheriff's Department after he is charged with stealing cocaine from an evidence locker, a crime he is later found guilty of and for which he receives a suspended sentence. On January 18, 2001, Amy's father, Dwayne Floyd Rowe, passes away. It's a difficult time for the Rowe family, and Dwayne sadly goes to his grave, never knowing the fate of his beloved daughter. Steve begins trying to move on with his life, though he remains haunted by Amy's disappearance. Some 4 years after she was last seen, the rift between Steve, law enforcement, and the Rowe family continues to widen. 6 years after Amy was last seen, in April of 2003, a man named Dale Wayne Eaton is arrested and charged with the 1988 abduction, rape, and murder of Lisa Marie Kimmel. The case, known as the Lil Miss case, due to the vanity plate on Kimmel's car, was featured on national news and shows such as Unsolved Mysteries. The case was solved when Eaton, an inmate at the time, had a DNA hit in relation to evidence from the case. Investigators then went to Eaton's property, where they found Kimmel's car, buried in his backyard. Eaton was tried and sentenced to death for the crimes. His property was later awarded to Kimmel's family as the result of a civil suit filed against him. Authorities were informed by Eaton's brother and sister-in-law that he was known to have been camping in the Burnt Gulch area around the time Amy vanished. The total distance from Eaton's campsite to the location of Amy's car is barely a mile. It was later learned that less than 2 months after Amy's disappearance, Eaton had abducted a couple at gunpoint along Interstate 80, only 125 miles away from Lander. Unfortunately, Eaton has refused to speak with any law enforcement officials about Amy's case or any other cases. FBI profilers believe that Eaton's murder of Kimmel was unlikely his first or his last, but with no leverage, there was little investigators can do to pressure him to speak. When asked about Eaton, Nels responded, quote, "He's familiar with the area. Authorities believe there's a strong possibility that he killed others, so I think that if you were to look at the odds of somebody with the capacity and intent, he's certainly right up there." End quote. Steve, on the other hand, disagreed and believed that Eaton, while obviously a sick individual and convicted killer, is likely just an easy answer to a hard question. It's Steve's belief that authorities want to pin the murder on Eaton just to get some measure of closure, whether or not it's the right answer. In June of 2004, nearly 7 years after Amy's disappearance, Steve had her declared legally dead and later remarried. He's now a father and went into business running a gym. He still resides in Lander. Less than a year later, in 2005, Amy's family took the money which had been set up as a reward and instead converted it into athletic scholarships named after Amy at the University of Wyoming and Northwest College. In September of 2011, the Fremont County Sheriff's Department decided to have fresh eyes examine the case. Detective John Zerga was put in charge of reinvestigating. Throughout his investigation, Zerga has gone back to the cottage where Amy and Steve lived, done testing with luminol, and brought in cadaver dogs, but nothing was found. Cadaver dogs were brought to the new home that Steve and Amy had purchased, but there were no indications there either. Zerga notes many mistakes in the initial investigation, including, but not limited to, having had tunnel vision around Steve and not looking elsewhere, allowing Amy's vehicle to be driven home by friends the night it was found, lost accounts from witnesses that weren't questioned, and tips that weren't followed all the way. It's difficult to look back with hindsight, but Zerga explains, quote, "The investigation was not good for at least the first 3 days. There was a lot of stuff that was lost." End quote. In the years since Amy's disappearance, little has developed. A watch was found, similar to the style that Amy wore. Cadaver dogs have been brought in over the years, some indicating the scent of a body, others never indicating, but nothing's ever found. A pen, perhaps belonging to Amy, was found. Every time someone uncovers animal bones, they call it in, and it's examined to ensure it isn't connected to Amy. For her family, it's been an incredibly difficult thing to accept that the answers may never be found. Joanne returned to Lander some years later, wanting to put up ribbons and flyers again. When speaking to a store owner who was unaware that she was Amy's mother, the man questioned why this case wasn't allowed to rest yet. For Joanne, it showed her that things had changed, and while she never could, the town of Lander was ready to move on. In a case spanning more than 20 years, with little to no evidence whatsoever, and some of the most extensive searches which can be conducted for a missing person, the disappearance of Amy Bechtel continues to haunt her family, law enforcement, and all of those who knew her, loved her, and whose lives were touched by her. In the absence of solid evidence, several theories have been developed over the years. The first theory suggests that Amy's disappearance may have been related to an accident. For a long time, rumors floated around Lander that Amy may have been killed in a hit and run and her body disposed of elsewhere. There have been different branches to the story and different suspects named, but the possibility cannot be completely ruled out. The second theory approaches the possibility that Amy's husband, Steve Bechtel, may have been responsible for his wife's disappearance and death. Many feel that his refusal to take the polygraph test and his choice to distance himself from investigators and the family suggests some level of guilt or responsibility, while others argue that Steve did all he could to find Amy and ultimately paid the price of being considered guilty of this horrible crime. The third and final theory follows the idea of a random act of violence. Whether it was Dale Eaton or someone else, the idea that Amy may have come across someone who was out looking for trouble is impossible to rule out. Many who knew Amy said she was an incredibly kind and caring person, that she'd go out of her way to help others. Some believe that Amy may have come across somebody who preyed upon her caring nature and used it to take advantage of her. To this day, Fremont County deputies believe Amy was likely the victim of a homicide. When last seen, Amy Bechtel was described as being a Caucasian female with blonde hair and blue eyes. Her hair was shoulder length at the time, and she has pierced ears. Amy wore a size 8 shoe and contact lenses. She has scars on both shins and knees, a checker-shaped scar on her lower back, and a scar on her left cheek. She was last seen wearing a yellow or gold tank top, black shorts, Adidas Trail Response sneakers, a Timex Ironman triathlon watch, and a small double wedding band on her left ring finger. It's been nearly 22 years since Amy Bechtel disappeared from Lander, Wyoming. She's been missing for nearly as long as she had been alive when she vanished that day in July of 1997. Over all these years, lives have moved on, faces have changed, and people forget. Those who loved Amy, her siblings, her mother, her friends, they will never forget. And each day they still maintain hope that sometime the answers might be found and Amy might be brought home. Though with each passing year, that hope dwindles more and more. One thing, though, almost everyone associated with this case believes: somewhere out there, someone knows exactly what happened to Amy Bechtel. The disappearance of Amy Bechtel is one of those cases that's just absolutely baffling. A bright, beautiful young woman with her whole life ahead of her goes out for a run one afternoon, just like she's done 100 times before, but this time, she doesn't come home. In the aftermath, her family is broken by her disappearance. Her husband becomes the center of attention for suspicion and speculation. Unlike many disappearances, this one stands out insomuch as there's so little evidence in existence. We don't have DNA or fibers, there's no hair or tire marks, footprints or traces of blood. There's a car, a location, and the vastness of the wilderness. Almost since the day Amy disappeared, rumors have circulated about what may have happened. Some believe Amy had been the victim of a hit and run. Others argued that she may have simply chosen to leave her life behind. Some believe Amy may have been suicidal and went into the wilderness to take her own life, while yet others argue that Amy's own husband knows what became of her and had a hand in her death. There have been thousands of tips, sightings, and theories. So-called psychics have claimed to have seen visions of Amy everywhere from beneath a tree to the Florida Panhandle. Steve Bechtel doesn't believe Amy is out there on those mountains. Investigators have no proof, but believe Amy was likely the victim of a homicide. The more you peel back the layers of this case, the more questions you are presented with. All questions, never answers. In a situation such as this, with so many opinions, questions, suspicions, and differing points of view, theories are often developed and put forth to try and answer some of those nagging questions that have been lingering for more than 20 years. While there are countless theories related to Amy's disappearance, there are three primary theories which are generally considered the most likely. The first of these theories is that Amy's disappearance may have been the result of someone covering up an accident. The loop road on which Amy was running is hardly an easy run, let alone an easy drive. The road curves sharply on switchbacks, ascending more than 2,000 feet in its first 6 miles alone. When the road finally plateaus, there is wilderness and beauty all around, but also a sense of emptiness and isolation. It's the perfect location to run, to clear your mind, to forget about everything going on, and to make it only about yourself and the picturesque vistas around you. While that can be a calm, gentle, and beautiful vacancy to experience, it can also be the kind of place where someone who has done something wrong might be able to cover it up without having to worry about too many people coming along. Early on in Amy's disappearance, a rumor circulated through Lander. This rumor suggested that some Native Americans from the nearby Arapaho-Shoshone Reservation, known as the Wind River Reservation, were out for a drive and were intoxicated. According to this rumor, the men accidentally struck Amy with their truck while she was running along the side of the road. At this time, it's been alleged that the men exited the truck, picked up Amy, and placed her in the bed of the truck before driving her out to a secluded location, possibly on the reservation, where she was buried in a shallow grave. It's unclear whether or not this theory alleges that Amy was killed when she was struck, or if she died later as the result of her wounds. The hit-and-run theory, when it comes to a missing runner, is not all that uncommon, but in this particular case, the Fremont County Sheriff's Department managed to follow up on it quite thoroughly. They spoke with the Indian Affairs Police and requested permission to search the reservation, which they were granted. Along with the assistance of tribal police, the Sheriff's Department managed to track down the individuals who were named in the rumor and the truck that was described as well. The men were questioned, the vehicle was brought in for processing, and every inch of its interior and exterior was examined for any evidence that might point towards this rumor being true. The vehicle was clean. Nothing was found to indicate a hit and run had taken place or that a body had ever been in the bed. The men were able to provide alibis for the day, stating emphatically that they hadn't been involved in a hit and run, and there was nothing beyond the whispers of townsfolks to incriminate them. For authorities, it became clear that if this was a hit and run, these men were likely not the ones involved. But what about somebody else? It isn't difficult to imagine that someone could have struck Amy with their vehicle. Of course, the question would be whether it was intentional or accidental. It isn't uncommon for people to hit runners with their cars, not enough to kill them, but just enough to knock them down or injure them to make them easier to abduct. This is certainly something which could have happened here. Someone hits Amy, knocks her to the ground, offers to help her, drive her to her car, or take her to a hospital or whatever. And once this person gets her inside, she's unable to escape, and the person takes her wherever he pleases and does whatever his twisted mind wants. That's a possibility that simply can't be ignored and has happened many times before. On the other hand, there is the possibility that someone could have come careening down Loop Road and struck Amy hard enough to have killed her. This person, in response, in a panic, could have taken Amy elsewhere to dispose of her body in hopes that the crime would never be discovered. This again can't be ruled out as a possibility, and considering the vastly rural nature of the surrounding areas, the possible locations someone might take Amy to conceal her remains are nearly limitless. A local, familiar with the area, would certainly know of places that no one ever went to, or which were so difficult to get to that it was unlikely anyone would ever check them. Of course, the hit-and-run theory has its flaws. If it was a violent enough hit to have caused death, it'd be hard to imagine the road and shoulder wouldn't have been stained with blood, which would have likely still been present by the next morning when the sun came up and investigators, searchers, and family members were all making their way up Loop Road. Body shops would have likely reported repairing a vehicle which appeared to have been damaged from colliding with a living creature, especially if blood and hair were present. Sure, they could know a person to pay off to keep their mouth shut, but could they afford enough to make this person not want to cash in the $100,000 reward that was later offered? That seems unlikely. The fact of the matter is, without any evidence one way or another, a hit and run is a theory which is just as possible as anything else. It wouldn't be the first time that a runner, or anyone, was struck on the side of the road and the person attempted to cover it up. Remember, Lander was a big town for people to visit for rock climbing and other activities. There were often people there who weren't locals, who had no connection, and who, if something like this happened, wouldn't have a problem leaving the area quickly and never being noticed as having been there at all. In the case of a hit and run, this theory can neither be ruled out nor ruled in. It is one of those open-ended possibilities that haunts this case, and has, for more than 20 years. The second theory, and one of the most popular, is that Amy's disappearance is in some way related to her husband, Steve Bechtel. This theory has existed nearly since the day Amy disappeared. From Steve's casual behavior on the 911 call to the journals later discovered, which many have said depicted a violent and controlling man. The husband is almost always the first suspect, and in this case, it wasn't all that different, other than the fact that Steve was never an official suspect. He may have been a person of interest, but there was never enough evidence to actually qualify him legally as a suspect. So what do we have when it comes to Steve Bechtel? Well, authorities didn't feel that his alibi was solid. His friends said they were both in Du Bois hiking a rock wall. They planned to climb it, but when the weather started getting bad, they elected to map out a route but not actually climb the wall. Steve met this friend there, having driven his blue pickup truck alone. When the afternoon ended, Steve drove back home alone. The only evidence that existed showing either of the men had even been there was a receipt for gas in Du Bois. But this was a receipt for Steve's friend. Authorities felt it was entirely possible that Steve either never went to Du Bois that day and that his friend lied for him, or that he left earlier than he admitted, or perhaps that he had been there but still had enough time to get back, track down Amy, murder her, and make it home in time to pretend he was concerned. It's difficult to speak to the context of the journals. Having not read them cover to cover and only having seen select excerpts, sure, it seems like some dark stuff that could suggest a violent, controlling situation between Steve and Amy. However, it's difficult to know what's true and what isn't. Some people write extensively about things that never happened or their innermost thoughts that they'd never acted on. Steve would later claim the journals were from when he was in a band, and a lot of them were song lyrics, and the rest were just thoughts he jotted down to get them out of his head. Authorities and Amy's family disagreed. The quotes I have seen are absolutely unsettling, but the context is never shown. Would those journals still have been viewed this way if Amy wasn't missing? It's difficult to say, but the journals, while adding suspicion, did little in terms of actual evidence. A witness claimed to have seen Steve's blue pickup truck that day on Loop Road with a blonde woman in the passenger seat. It was this witness who gave authorities probable cause to execute search warrants on the home and the truck. Of course, when it was all said and done, all they walked away with were the journals. There was nothing else found. No blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing at all. That doesn't necessarily clear Steve, but it also doesn't incriminate him. If you take it a step further, when both Steve and the truck were presented to the witness, this person was unable to make a positive identification. That pretty much sealed the deal. The one witness they had simply couldn't say whether or not it was the truck, and the witness hadn't gotten a good enough look at the driver to know if it was Steve or not. Also factor in that the witness alleged to have made this sighting at approximately the same time that phone record showed Steve was making calls from the cottage. Many believe Steve was guilty once he elected not to take the polygraph. While this is a common belief, most people who are familiar with polygraphs don't trust them, and lawyers almost never advise a client to take one. There's little benefit, if any at all. If Steve fails, they think he's guilty. If he passes, polygraphs are not admissible in court, so if he's ever charged, the results of that test can't be used to defend him. Steve argued it was the way he was approached, that they basically told him they knew he killed his wife, and then asked. He's freely admitted that had they not accused him, he probably would have taken the polygraph, even though all these years later, he has stated that he would never take one because they simply aren't reliable. Not taking a polygraph is not a sign of guilt. Frankly, I wouldn't take a polygraph to prove that I didn't steal a lollipop, let alone to prove not being involved in a major crime. None of this is evidence that Steve was involved. Amy's family later suggested that Steve may have been abusive towards her, recounting a story about seeing bruises on her arms and Amy explaining that Steve could get rough sometimes. Steve's lawyer denied that he ever put his hands on Amy, and while this is a compelling story, it's difficult to imagine that if the family believed Amy was being abused, they would have just let it slide this way. It's hard to say, but this entire situation involving the possibility of abuse is speculative at best. Again, we simply have no evidence here. So what do we know for certain about Steve? Despite hiring a lawyer and disconnecting from police and Amy's family, he continued to look for Amy. He organized searches, offered his own rewards, worked with friends to mail out flyers and man a tip line. He gave a speech at the 10K exclaiming that they were going to find Amy and that they wouldn't stop searching. Steve continued to put in efforts to locate his wife for years following her disappearance, which is just not the typical behavior of someone who played a role in it. Now, some believe this was just an incredible effort on his part to act concerned and prove he wasn't involved. Certainly that's a possibility, but if that's what happened, he did a pretty good job. Steve's sentences, body language, and movements have all been extensively analyzed, bringing in a wide array of results, from unconscious nodding to signs of anger and frustration. But you're also looking at a man who, for all intents and purposes, loved his wife, and is being accused of killing her all the while he's working hard to find her. It's hard to imagine some frustration wouldn't rise up. Authorities initially found Steve's 911 call to be suspicious, and yes, it seems casual, and his tone doesn't seem to fit the seriousness of the situation. But the Isabel Celis case taught us, if nothing else, someone's behavior on a 911 call doesn't always suggest their direct state of mind. Some people laugh when bad things happen, others cry. Everyone reacts to a stressful, frightening, and traumatic situation differently. The problem here is, while the spouse is almost always the first person to look at, there's really little here to point towards Steve other than the fact that Amy was his wife. Authorities seem to zero in on him, possibly as a result of a lack of anywhere else to go. Even Deputy Zerga years later admits that those investigators may have had tunnel vision. How much did that affect the investigation? That's an impossible question to answer. The fact of the matter is, we simply don't know whether or not Steve was involved. Police tried to find a motive, but outside of the journals, there was nothing. Some friends said their relationship was warm and loving, others said it was cold and distant. Differing views and opinions galore. There wasn't a large life insurance policy on Amy, so Steve had no financial benefit other than gaining sole ownership of the house that they had just bought. But at the same time, the absence of Amy's income made that mortgage a little more difficult to pay for. Zerga even went back to their old house and used luminol and cadaver dogs years later, finding nothing. He brought cadaver dogs to the home they had purchased, and again, nothing. This is a theory for which we cannot know one way or the other, and there isn't enough information on either side to really know which way to lean. If Steve committed this crime, he did so in a way where he left no evidence, established a good alibi, and has managed to keep his mouth shut for more than 20 years. When Dale Eaton was arrested for murder, and authorities tried to connect him to Amy's disappearance, Steve argued against it. Why would someone, if he had killed his wife, try to deter investigators from pinning the crime on someone else? It doesn't make a great deal of sense. There is little which can be said about this theory other than it's a possibility. The third and final theory is that Amy Bechtel became the victim of a person or persons who were in that area at that time and had the propensity to commit crimes such as abduction and murder. We begin with Dale Eaton because he has a history of this kind of crime and was located approximately 1 mile away from the spot where Amy's car was found. Or at least his campground was. Where Eaton was the day Amy disappeared, we have no way of knowing, and he hasn't answered any questions since he's been asked about it. What we know is that he was in the area, owned firearms, had committed abduction, rape, and murder less than a decade earlier, for which he wouldn't be caught for another few years, and less than 2 months after Amy's disappearance, he abducted a couple at gunpoint whose vehicle had broken down along Interstate 80, some 125 miles away. Eaton makes an excellent possibility in this case given all those reasons, but much like everything else, there's no evidence to connect Eaton to Amy. He definitely could have come across this beautiful young woman and used a gun to force her to come along with him. He could have pretended he needed help and gained the upper hand. Any number of things could have happened involving Eaton, and sadly, we simply can't know for sure. It does seem like a statistical unlikelihood that a woman disappears and a known killer is less than a mile away and there's no connection, but there's no certainty either way. Perhaps Eaton learned from his previous murder to leave the vehicle behind, to try and get the victim out in the open, to not leave any physical evidence behind, or perhaps he got incredibly lucky in that he wasn't caught. FBI profilers believe Eaton likely committed other crimes such as the one for which he was sentenced later. That's probably true, but considering that his DNA was run through the system and the only hit they got was on the Kimmel murder, he either made sure bodies weren't found in the future, or he was a lot more careful about what he left behind. At the same time, Eaton disposed of Kimmel's car by burying it in his backyard. That's a bizarre thing to do, and certainly doesn't seem like the kind of thing you could do very often. Whether or not Eaton was involved in Amy's disappearance, we may never know, unless he finally decides to start talking. Even then, unless he could direct authorities to her remains, it would be hard to know if you could believe a single word he was saying. If it wasn't Eaton, then it could have been basically anyone. Whether this was an abduction followed by a murder or directly a murder, we can't know. The area from which Amy vanished was searched extensively time and time again. It seems likely that had she been killed in that area, something would have been found, but it's dense, difficult terrain with a lot of places that a body could be concealed. For many, they don't believe Amy is there. They believe someone abducted her and took her elsewhere, and that's a possibility that can't be ignored. The sad fact of the matter is, if someone came upon Amy while she was running, it would have been difficult for her to escape, especially if the person was brandishing a weapon or somehow lured her in, maybe even by asking for help. Almost everyone who examines this case believes that Amy was the victim of a homicide. Most of them believe she was killed the same day she disappeared. Homicide seems like the most likely scenario in this case, though with no evidence and not much to go on, almost anything's a possibility. The idea that Amy either fell victim to Eaton or some other yet unknown killer for many is the most likely scenario and the most difficult to accept. The disappearance of Amy Bechtel is an incredibly frustrating and heartbreaking case to examine. We live all of our lives believing it's impossible for someone to simply vanish. And yet with this case, that seems to be exactly what occurred. A young woman, out running, never returns home, and not a single trace of her is found. It seems to be against all odds and possibilities, and yet for now, this remains the state of Amy's disappearance, some 22 years later. The hope remains that this case will someday be solved, whether someone will eventually come across Amy's remains, a killer will admit to the crime, someone will come forward with knowledge or a solid tip, or investigators will find something that they had missed in the past. Until one of these things happens, however, the disappearance of Amy Bechtel will haunt those who loved her, and the city of Lander will never be quite the same, sitting in the shadow of the very wilderness Amy entered and never came out of. For now, the disappearance of Amy Bechtel remains open, unsolved, and incredibly cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel, there are many forums, news articles, and magazine stories written about her case. The television show Disappeared addressed her case, and many podcasts have dug into her story as well. If you have any information about what may have happened to Amy Wroe Bechtel, please contact the Fremont County Sheriff's Department or the FBI. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. A special thank you goes out to Patreon producers Amanda Lee Ruth Smith, Krista Colvin, D'Earthy, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Kate Alexander, Megan Cotter, Tara Doble, and the Rains of Yesteryear. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence. Visit trace-evidence.com for all episodes, social media links, merchandise, and more. I want to thank you all for listening to this episode. I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.